What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carry inside. Mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, hitting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I have to let you know that I've been doing my show for 28 months, and so far, tonight's show is the show that I am most excited about. People who know me know that I am not a hero worshiper. In fact, I'm a Bernie supporter, and every time people go to his rallies and shout, "Bernie, Bernie, Bernie," he says, no, no, not Bernie, not me, us. And I'm totally a believer that it's the grassroots, that it's social movements that make change. But I have to make an exception for the man who I'm interviewing tonight, because he is a true hero by every definition. And that man is Daniel Ellsberg. This is a man who Henry Kissinger called the most dangerous man in America and the man who had to be stopped. Well, fortunately for this country, you were not stopped. Welcome to this program. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you. That's a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much, Lauren.
Tell us about your background, your service in the Marines, your work for the Defense and the State Departments, and what made you start out as an ardent anti-communist?
In 1950, when the communists invaded, when the North Koreans invaded South Korea, I took that in the sense in which nearly everyone in the country did, which was that North Korea was committing aggression. Now turns out to be a complicated question. I.F. Stone, for instance, raised a lot of questions about exactly what preceded that event. But it is pretty well agreed now that the North Koreans did cross the line at that time ahead of the South Koreans and invaded. And coming out of the Second World War, I was very supportive of the position that we opposed aggression, as we did in the Second World War, and that we were prepared to sacrifice and risk in part of a collective effort to oppose aggression. So I definitely approved of the war, of our response to it. In retrospect, I have a lot of questions about that. But at the time, I did get deferments for a couple of years studying at Harvard. I've gotten the benefit of that, including a year in Cambridge University, England. I volunteered for the Marine Corps on the grounds that someone else had to go in my place for the last couple of years, and I felt it was my obligation to go there. I didn't have any attraction to the military at all, particularly, but under the circumstances, we were still at war. I did volunteer for the Marines. I was 3 years in the Marine Corps, rising to the level of a commander of a rifle company. I was the only first lieutenant in the 2nd Marine Division who actually had command of a rifle company. It's usually a captain or higher. In fact, I replaced a major. So I was proud of that. And in the course of that, actually, I extended for a year in the Marine Corps because my battalion, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was being sent to the Mediterranean. And we had already had a lot of newspaper articles that there was likely to be war in that area while my battalion was over there, because Nasser had just nationalized the Suez Canal, and there was a possibility that war would arise out of that some way or other. And indeed, when we were in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, steaming toward it, when the British and French actually committed aggression against Egypt, denounced really by President Eisenhower, for whom I had not voted, certainly, I'm a Democrat, but I supported his position to criticize and condemn, really, British and French aggression. They were our closest allies, and I was very impressed that an American president whether I voted for him or not, was willing to oppose the actions of our closest allies. And in fact, we didn't really know going into that whether we would be somehow involved against the British and French and Israelis who joined them, or against Egypt in some way. The way it turned out, we actually evacuated on our troop ship 1,500 American civilians from the embassy and tourists from Alexandria Harbor while the British and French actually were bombing the environs of the harbor. I came back and I was a fellow in the Society of Fellows, a very good fellowship at Harvard, for 2.5 years. I missed half a year of a 3-year fellowship. While I was in the Society of Fellows for a summer, because I was interested in what's called decision theory, decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. It's a subspecialty in economics at that time, just arising, as a matter of fact. And Rand was kind of the Vatican of work on decision theory in the abstract decision-making. When I got there, I discovered that I was assigned to work in connection with problems that were not abstract at all. And that was the possibility of the president having to make a decision on whether to launch our bombers and our intercontinental ballistic missiles on the basis of warning that missiles from the Soviet Union were on the way from our radars and eventually from satellites. And I was very interested in the assessment of the people at Rand that warning would be ambiguous. That was their word. It would be uncertain. In fact, there have been a number of false alarms over in 1960. Earlier, I think it was a flock of geese that were mistaken for high-flying bombers. And in 1960, radar bouncing off the moon reported that there was a nearly 100% certainty that we were under a major missile attack as these radar signals kept coming back. That was when our ballistic missile early warning system was first turned on and caused quite a panic at the North American Air Defense Command. So the question was, faced with ambiguous indications, when and how or whether should the president actually launch bombers which could be recalled or missiles which can't be recalled, either of those. That's almost, in the latter case, virtually deciding on a major exchange of nuclear weapons between the US and Soviet Union. So there was a question that was the ultimate question of decision-making under uncertainty. And it so happened that was the summer of 1958, which was the height of what came to be known as the missile gap. The estimates by the intelligence community that the Russians were way ahead of us on intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. They had tested one first before we were able to in 1957. We weren't able to for some months after that. They'd also put up Sputnik, which showed that they had the ability to get an intercontinental ballistic missile over to us, and with sufficient accuracy, at least, to get it over to us, though not with point accuracy at that time. Okay, so I lived then in considerable fear, concern, that we would suffer a surprise attack by the Russians. My colleagues at RAND, based on these top secret estimates, were convinced that Russia was an expansionist power, which seemed to be indicated by the support of the North Koreans and by a Berlin crisis that had arisen in 1958 and was still going on. The concern was that we had to deter them from doing this by having an ability to retaliate in mass against the Soviet Union should they attack us. And that ability, Rand believed, was not assured at all, given the supposed superiority they had in ICBMs. They could wipe out our Strategic Air Command. And the result of that concern, by the way, was that I and Alan Enthoven, who were the two youngest members of the economics department working on this, did not sign up for a retirement plan that was very generously supported by RAND. It was TIAA CREF retirement. And we didn't think there was a chance we would live to cash in on that we could best postpone a Russian attack, which that was what we were working night and day, really. I figure I spent about 70-hour weeks 7-day weeks it ran, reading up on the subject and making analyses of it for that. I came as a permanent employee in 1959 then, and worked there for a number of years on the command and control of nuclear weapons, and in particular on the problem of whether nuclear weapons of ours might be sent off without authorization. Actually, on this sort of ambiguous evidence, very specifically, it turned out that this is one of our most closely held secrets at the time, which I became aware of on a task force for the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Admiral Felt in Hawaii, who wanted to be sure that if he gave the order to go to launch, that it would be received, despite atmospheric interference or the possibility that the Russians would interfere. I particularly began to focus on a different problem. What was the chance that our forces would take off, or some of them, without a go order from either Felt or the president, who was supposedly the only person who could give that order? I found in my work in the Pacific that this great secret that Eisenhower had in fact delegated to Admiral Felt and to General LeMay of SAC and to a number of other unified and specified commanders the authority to launch nuclear weapons if they believed they were under attack at a time when they were out of communications with Washington, or if the president was incapacitated, as Eisenhower had been twice with a stroke and a heart attack. And if they felt, in other words, that they couldn't get an order from Washington, Eisenhower had very secretly authorized them to go on their own. What I learned was that they had in turn, for the same reasons, delegated that authority to their subordinate commanders. Felt, for example, was out of communication in Hawaii in those days before satellites. Part of every day he was on his own, in effect, on this decision. He had in turn delegated this to 7th Fleet and others, to PACAF and others in the Pacific, in case he was out of communications. There were many, many fingers on buttons that were authorized to use them if they felt this uncertainty and they felt it was time to go. And I also found that it could be done without authorization in a number of ways. So those are continuing problems for every nuclear state. I doubt if any nuclear state of the 9 that exists now would allow its retaliatory capability to be paralyzed by an attack on the leader himself. We, for example, made threats, Trump has, and his predecessors have exercised and made threats of decapitating North Korea under various circumstances. We do that very openly in exercises, attacking the leadership, even preparing to land special forces officers, teams rather, to do that. The chance that Kim has allowed his retaliatory capability to be paralyzed by that is extremely low. Certainly the US and the Russians have never allowed that.
Fast forward to what you were working on, how you got access to these Pentagon Papers, and what did you discover in the papers that turned you against the war in Vietnam?
Actually, as early as 1961, I'd been part of a Pentagon task force looking at various limited war capabilities. It took me to Vietnam, among other places, along with a team. And I, again, studied night and day there, reading, I'm a big reader, on the reports of our advisors in Vietnam, which was all we had there, not combat units. And they'd convinced me as early as 1961 that this was a very losing proposition for the U.S. to be involved in that any more than it was already. But it basically was a replay of the war with the French. I didn't realize at that time we had financed that war. I learned that later. But so it was really a U.S.-French war as early as that. But thinking of it as a French war, they had been defeated by the Viet Minh, the precursor to what we call the Viet Cong, the communist-led nationalist forces against foreign occupiers in Vietnam as early as 1945 and 46, nearly until 54 when the French left. The Geneva Accords of 1954, after they had been defeated in their outpost of Dien Bien Phu. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and Eisenhower had considered very strongly giving nuclear weapons to the French to defend them at Dien Bien Phu, and the French refused those. on the grounds that it endangered their troops and might lead to a larger war. But in other words, our nuclear threats, which had also occurred in Korea, which I wasn't that conscious at the time, as early as 1950. But in 1954, we were again making nuclear threats in Indochina. That was the time I entered the Marines, as a matter of fact. I was on the drill field when our drill sergeant told us our rifles had better be clean because Dien Bien Phu, we called it Dien Bien Phu, just fell. And the chance that Marines would get involved in that colonial war, essentially, was not small at that time. In fact, there was a Marine battalion offshore Vietnam at that point, awaiting the possibility of getting directly involved. I came back from 1961 and told my colleagues at RAND, don't get involved in consulting on this war. This was after the Bay of Pigs, by the way. I saw it already as another Bay of Pigs. But then, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which I was involved because of my work on command and control of nuclear weapons, and the challenge of nuclear weapons now in Cuba, I was involved there, sleeping in the Pentagon several nights during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then I studied it as a nuclear crisis. I'd learned by now that there was not a threat of a Soviet surprise attack, which had so worried me and Alan Enthoven back in 1958, 59, 60. In 61, we learned that the Russians did not have the 1,000 missiles that the commander of Strategic Air Command, Thomas Bauer, estimated when I was at his headquarters in Omaha in August. There was not 1,000, there were four ICBMs at a time when we had 40 going on, many more, plus a couple of thousand planes within range of the Soviet Union. They had perhaps 190 bombers in range of the US. And we had other missiles, Polaris, and intermediate range missiles of the kind that are in question right now because of the canceling of the INF treaty, the intermediate range treaty. So I realized that Rand and I had been on a false track for a number of years. This focus on the possibility of a Soviet surprise attack, we were looking at the wrong question altogether. And our work had been irrelevant at best and misleading in the way of not contributing to the real problems we were facing. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, I saw that those included the real problems. They had the possibility of a miscalculated war, an actual war rising, not by the calculated first strike of either side, but rather by a series of miscalculations and unjustified bargaining point maneuvers that were quite dangerous, provocative to either side. So I set out to study that process, and I did a very highly classified study of nuclear crises, and it was including the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was in the course of that a Harvard law professor named John McNaughton, who was now the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, offered me to be his assistant, his special assistant, coming in at the highest civil service grade, actually, GS-18, which is equivalent in civilian terms to a lieutenant general, between a major and lieutenant general. And to have all the clearances that he had. As he put it, he said, you're interested in crises. Vietnam is a continuing crisis. And although we didn't think of it as a nuclear crisis the way wrongly, he did say, you'll learn more about crises working in the government that you ever could just as a consultant. And that turned out to be true. So I now was working night and day, again, on the question of Vietnam for the Assistant Secretary. And it so happens that my first day on the job, and this was a coincidence, was the day that bombing started of Vietnam for the first time since Korea, the first in Vietnam. It ended 9 years later after we had dropped 4 times the tonnage of bombs on Indochina that we had dropped in all of World War II. That started on my first day in the Pentagon when there was a false warning of an attack on our destroyers in the Tonkin Gulf. The captain in charge there, Captain Herrick, did at first believe in cables I was reading in the Pentagon that he was under attack, and he continued to believe that for several hours, actually. But then, at the time that the president was making the decision to start bombing in retaliation, the captain, Eric, actually said, in effect, hold everything. Nearly all previous reports, except perhaps the first one, have been mistaken or in question. An overeager sonar man, the sound system there, has mistaken the beat of our ship's propellers against our wake as we crisscross in the sea here, evading all these torpedoes. The captain believed there had been one torpedo, but that was put in question by the fact that he had also believed in the previous 20 torpedoes. So by the time the president and McNamara announced that night that we had unequivocal evidence of an attack and were responding, I knew that was a lie. That was my first night in the Pentagon. I spent all night there that night, watching the raids, which were 12 hours time difference there, so they were happening in the daylight, and knew that they were happening on the basis of extremely equivocal evidence. And within days, I knew that the statement that was unequivocal was a lie, just as the statement by under Bush and all his officials, George W. Bush, that there were WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, in Iraq. They said that was unequivocal, determinate. That was just as much of a lie, it turned out, as Tonkin Gulf. At best, the evidence toward that was very equivocal, very ambiguous, very uncertain, and in both cases turned out to be false. On that basis, we started bombing North Vietnam in '64, ending that in '73. And on that basis, we invaded Iraq in as clear-cut, a much more clear-cut case of aggression, really, by the United States, as North Korea showed in its southern half of Korea. But let's say as clear-cut as Hitler's invasion of Poland. No real difference in terms of aggression there. In the very case of Poland, most people don't know this, Hitler went to the trouble of creating false indications that Germany had been attacked. He actually put Polish captives in German uniforms and got them to attack a little base on the border and claimed that Germans had been attacked. Clear-cut, what they call now false flag operation. Didn't get much attention at the time, really. People understood that it was a clear-cut invasion by Hitler, but he did try to make it look as though he was acting second. As we know, for example, that Bush had suggested to Prime Minister Blair that we send over U-2s disguised as UN high-flying planes to justify our invasion of Iraq. And Blair had convinced him on that point not to do that. It would be too easily disproven.
I watched the documentary called The Most Dangerous Man about your life and the Pentagon Papers. And my favorite quote from you is, "It wasn't that we were on the wrong side, we were the wrong side." And you talked about lies that Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, and LBJ advanced, basically to avoid losing Indochina to communism. But you worked very closely with McNamara. You were asked to do some very specific research that made you feel personally culpable because you were proud to get that research. And then when you gave it to them, you saw that he utilized that to advance the war. Do you want to talk about what that research was?
But the particular scene in the Post where I'm telling McNamara that the situation in 1966 was very much the same as a year earlier, although we had put more than 100,000 troops more into Vietnam. And his reaction was, that means that the situation is worse because we put 100,000 more troops in there and nothing has improved. That means it's worse. At that moment, the pilot said, "Take your seats, gentlemen. We're about to land at Andrews Air Force Base." And literally within minutes, very steep descent, we were on the ground. McNamara was facing a ring of TV cameras, as in the movie, and saying to them in his opening words, "I'm very reassured at the progress we've made in every dimension of the war. We are making progress. minutes after he told me that it was not only not progress, it was the worst situation was worse. And I remember saying to my fiancee, later my wife, Patricia, in a tape, this story, and saying, I hope I'm never in a position where I have to lie like that. This was a man who was very able to lie, and to lie convincingly, McNamara, which is to say, he was an official, able to keep his job.
Right.
That's a requirement. That's the requirement for a job of an official who speaks to the press. He has to be willing to lie to the public and do so convincingly and without showing embarrassment or hesitation. And that's pretty much true of every official who stays in the national security field.
Yeah, you know, I was speaking about when you were asked to research incidences of the Viet Minh torturing the other side, and you had come up with 2 incidents, and you said they were probably the only 2 incidents, but you reported that to your bosses.
They were involved in atrocities, as we were. By the way, we ended up reporting that there's thousands of atrocities on their side. We killed enormously more than that, in not only in the Phoenix program, but especially in our bombing program. We killed far more civilians than the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong in the South were responsible for. But they certainly did do, I think, referring actually not to atrocities, interestingly, but to actual attacks on military units of ours. Couldn't call them, we didn't even call them atrocities on our side. And that was the attack on Pleiku in February, a base in Vietnam. And about 3 days later, Quy Nhon. But the question was, what would our response be to those attacks, which are an atrocity being essentially a war crime, an attack on civilians or not units or not part of the military. These were attacks on our military. McNamara wanted to begin bombing of North Vietnam at that point for reasons that were not clear and certainly didn't seem convincing to either my boss, John McNaughton, or to me. We both thought that bombing the North would not cause them to draw back and to give up or to withdraw from South Vietnam, but rather would just kill a lot of people, keep the war going, if anything, strengthen the dedication of the people in North Vietnam, which is actually what happened in the course of this. And we weren't the only ones who thought that. But McNamara, for reasons that to this day I can only speculate about, felt that the bombing should begin. One of those, by the way, was that he was very reluctant to put ground troops in. And he thought the bombing would be a substitute for ground troops. That night, I was asked then by McNamara, one of the very few times that an order came directly to me through McNaughton, and that was to gather evidence of atrocities that would justify the starting of our bombing. Now, actually, there were atrocities in this case, but the analogies of what I just told you about Hitler is very interesting. And frankly, I've never thought of it till this moment, but as I tell the story here, I realize the purpose, of course, of Hitler's false flag operation, that is, pretending that an attack actually instigated or carried out by our own forces was an attack by an enemy. Okay, in this case, Hitler, of course, wanted to appear to justify the invasion of Poland, which was actually clear-cut aggression. McNamara wanted evidence of atrocities now, in addition to the attacks, to justify and convince Johnson that he should start bombing. And Johnson, to his credit, I give credit where credit is due, he was a war criminal, as was McNamara, and as John McNaughton and I were in a lower level, I have little doubt, war criminals in our work on Vietnam. But in this case, Johnson, like McNaughton and me, thought bombing was not a promising project. It shouldn't happen. He used to say to McNamara, as McNaughton told me, "You're bombing bullshit." And that gave me a good impression of Johnson when I heard those debriefings from McNaughton, who had been in the Oval Office. I thought, this guy, I didn't know much about him, Johnson, has his feet on the ground here. I don't know why our boss is on the other side on this. But we worked for McNamara. McNaughton was very close to McNamara. I worked for McNaughton, and we did what was asked of us. And in that particular case, I was asked to collect evidence of actual atrocities by the Viet Cong in order to justify the bombing. I've looked back on that. I've often asked myself, okay, I understand why I did it that night. An order from McNamara was like an order from God at that point in the Pentagon. And I had backed McNamara very much in my mind because I felt he was very opposed to the use of nuclear weapons, which he was, as I was. And so I wanted to help him on that, even if I didn't agree with all of his current judgments. What I found hard to explain is why I stayed in the Pentagon then, knowing that we were starting something that was very fraught, almost surely to end after many years, disastrously in terms of having killed very many people. I didn't believe in it. Why did I stay with it after that night? I must have been involved in dating somebody that I didn't want to leave Washington for at that moment.
Let me go to the Tet Offensive in 1968, which was so pivotal to your deciding to stop keeping the secrets. And you released the report to Neil Sheehan of the New York Times. Why was that Tet Offensive so pivotal?
Well, the Tet Offensive appeared to, very much confirmed what I'd been saying in Vietnam for a couple of years at that point, since '66. And that was that we were thoroughly stalemated, that there had been no progress in Vietnam, despite our now having 550,000 troops there, and that there was no prospect of any further progress. Also, I feared that we would actually, if we gave General Westmoreland the 200,000 more troops that he was asking, 206,000 troops, bring us up to 750,000 troops, that he would do what he wanted to do, which was to invade North Vietnam. And that would probably bring the Chinese in and would lead to our using nuclear weapons against the Chinese, and not only in Vietnam, but probably against China. So at that point, I began leaking to Neil Sheehan a series of leaks, actually intending to let Johnson know that if he sent the 200,000 that Westmoreland was asking for, it couldn't be done secretly in little handfuls at a time, or at least they're saying, I've sent 50,000, I've sent another 50,000, revealing that he had in fact committed us to a very large expansion and probably to an invasion of North Vietnam. So I wanted him to know there was somebody who had access to these decisions, who was ready to give up his career, and I'd say his, we were all men at that point, except for secretaries who somehow had access to this information and would put it out if he sent another 200,000. He wouldn't be able to lie about his decision, as I knew he had done in the past. And in fact, Johnson said later, except for those leaks, I would have met Westmoreland's request. And those were probably the most effective leaks that I ever did make. That was a year and a half before the Pentagon Papers. And the security guy did identify me as the person who had access to all that stuff and probably was the source. And by a mistake, they didn't prosecute me. The mistake was that Johnson said not to prosecute Neil Sheehan and Hedrick Smith, who had released this information, it was their byline, because he didn't want to get into a fight with the New York Times at that point. If we can leap ahead to just a second, it's why Julian Assange has been charged with a very narrow charge at this point, which they hope will not be taken as a clear-cut assault on the New York Times, because they rely on it to put out their lies when need be. And the FBI mistakenly took that they shouldn't prosecute anyone. And so they laid off me at that point. And that made it possible for me to copy the Pentagon Papers a year and a half later.
Well, I want to talk about Henry Kissinger now, because one thing that surprised me when I rewatched the documentary about you was learning that Kissinger had actually advised Nixon to get out of Vietnam as long as we could negotiate a deal where the Viet Minh didn't take over immediately. And Nixon rejected that. And then in the Nixon tapes, he said, Nixon said that he was not concerned about civilian casualties. And Kissinger replied, I'm concerned about civilians because I don't want the world to be mobilized against you as a butcher. So I'm kind of wondering what your assessment was of Henry Kissinger. Is he just a war criminal or more of a practitioner of what he called or what is called realpolitik?
Practitioners of realpolitik get involved in war crimes if they get involved in war. That's certainly true of Kissinger and of Nixon. The quote you're making about the civilians certainly indicates, in that case, I think Kissinger wasn't just shining up to the boss when he said, I simply don't want you to get in the reputation of being a butcher. I'm sure that Kissinger did not care about the civilians any more than Nixon, but he was saying he was concerned about the public image. Just a few days before that exchange about the civilians, Nixon said he wanted a very heavy response to the offensive in 1972 of the North Vietnamese across the DMZ. And so he said he wanted to hit the dikes in North Vietnam, a clear-cut war crime, which, by the way, corresponded to a war crime for which we hanged a general after Nuremberg in World War II for having destroyed dikes and levees and various things in the Netherlands. And Nixon wanted to do the same thing in North Vietnam. And he said, okay, how many people would that kill or drown? And Kissinger says, I think roughly, 150,000 or so, something like that. And Nixon says, no, I'd rather use the nuclear bomb. Got that, Henry? And Kissinger says, I think that would be just too much. He says, the nuclear bomb, does that bother you? I just want you to think big. I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake. Okay, so Kissinger's position on that demonstrates, I think, a thing that comes up even now very much was you can't count on anyone to be wrong about everything all the time. It's the same quote later, about killing civilians indiscriminately. Whereas Kissinger was not always wrong in what he said.
You went to a non-violent resistance training and everything changed for you. And that was when you met Randy Keeler, and he said something that was very pivotal to you, as was the influence of your wife, Patricia. Can you explain what was it that he said that caused you to decide to release the Pentagon Papers?
Before I met Randy Keeler in 1969, I had worked for Kissinger by that time under Nixon and in early 69. And I had also been reading the Pentagon Papers. That's where I really learned in the summer of 69 that the war was not only inevitably stalemated, would never get improved, but that it had been an unjust cause from the beginning. It was reading the top secret Pentagon Papers that really revealed to me that we had never had a just cause there in Vietnam. We were always supporting basically a colonial or neo-colonial regime in Vietnam. So at that point, I came to see that what we were doing was unjustified homicide, which was murder. And that not only should we get out of there gradually or with grace and with no embarrassment, we should get out. We had no right killing anybody more in Vietnam. Just as I would say, by the way, we have no right to be killing anyone in Afghanistan or Iraq or any of the other, or Somalia or Sudan, or the other places that both Bush and then Obama and now Trump are killing people without justification. So I was at a point where I thought this had to stop fast. And that's when I went to a conference of the War Resistors League, International, which had been started really out of conscientious objectors in World War I. Einstein had been its honorary chairman for some years. And at this particular conference, I met people who were inspired by Gandhi and by Martin Luther King to do nonviolent, active resistance against wrongful policy at the cost of their own freedom or their own lives. And I'd read about such people for the previous year, inspired by people who've known Martin Luther King. And after his assassination, I read Barbara Deming, a very good book I want to recommend called Revolution and Equilibrium. I'd read Martin Luther King, I'd read Gandhi. And then I went to this conference really to meet people who were living by those principles. And there were hundreds of them there from all over the world. And one of them, Randy Keeler, was someone who had made an impression, a very good impression on me in the previous couple of days. And I thought Keeler was an example, like Bob Eaton, of the very best Americans we had, like the followers of Martin Luther King. And to my surprise, I heard him announce from the platform that he was about to be prosecuted in a trial. He was under arrest for resistance to the draft, not sending his whereabouts to the draft board, and that he expected to be in prison, like all the other members of the War Resistors League office in San Francisco. He said that all the other male members. And I was so startled at the thought that the best thing that a American of whom I was already thinking made me proud to be an American, that the best thing he could do was to go to prison, to resist as loudly as he could, non-violently, against a war that he knew to be unjust and wrongful, as I did. So I concluded at that point, I asked myself the question, what can I do to help shorten this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? Because as I saw his example, I saw that that should be an option, which I hadn't considered before. And within weeks of that, I began copying the top secret Pentagon Papers, which ended before the current administration, the Nixon administration. It ended in 1968, and Nixon came in 69. But I knew at that point that Nixon intended secretly to continue the war until he effectively won, until he arrived at terms that amounted to an American victory. The public didn't know that. He'd lied to them during the election as to what his intentions were. And I knew that. I knew it was worth going to prison to help shorten that, avert that, from the example of Randy Keeler and Bob Eaton and many others, David Harris. And so it was worth doing something that would put me in prison for life, I thought, even though I thought it had only a very small chance of helping shorten the war. But that was worth it.
You were at a May Day protest in 1971 with Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn. And I can tell you, I would give anything to go back in time and be at that protest with you. There were 2 million people there. And I'd love to see 2 million people get out in the streets now about Venezuela, for instance.
Yeah.
We're fomenting a coup d'etat in that country as we speak, and nobody seems to care about it. And I don't know if it's because we don't have the draft anymore. So then you started releasing it to the New York Times, and they put in an injunction. And then you started with the Washington Post. And all told, 17 organizations managed to release these papers, and including Mike Gravel, who is read it into the congressional record. He was a junior senator from Alaska, and he was filibustering about something.
Filibustering against the renewal of the draft, reinstatement of the draft. As I told him on the phone, if you're really going to filibuster like that, I can give you stuff to read that will keep you till Christmas.
So then you went underground. You managed to evade capture, so to speak, you and your wife. You talked about how you didn't use the telephone, and they didn't have the computer then, so they couldn't really track you. It was also known that your favorite movie, you saw it 7 times, was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So I'm wondering if there's a connection between that.
Nobody's asked me that precisely like that, so I haven't really thought of it. It's true that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were outlaws, living their own lives the way they wanted to live them. not unlike Easy Rider, where people ended up being killed, as in Butch Cassidy, now that I think of it. It's extremely lucky that I didn't end up like all those people in the end, because as my wife and I discuss all the time, whenever we see another arrest, like Julian Assange the other day, we think how lucky it was luck to a large extent. As I said, I was fingered earlier as the source of some major leaks back in 1968. That's just one of many times when we lucked out and we weren't stopped. And we were doing something that the government regarded as outlaw work beyond the law, although in fact, what they were doing every day was worthy of prosecution at The Hague, the criminal court, the prosecution, Nuremberg-like offenses. And what I had done of revealing truth to the American people, like Chelsea Manning or Ed Snowden, had never been prosecuted before my case. It was the very first. They had always shied away, the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice, from prosecuting it because the freedom of the press and of speech in the First Amendment has always been held to prevent the prosecution of journalists, rather, freedom of the press, and it had never been used against sources, even though there were leaks all the time. My wife and I were putting out the Pentagon Papers, had never been prosecuted as criminal because this is America with a First Amendment that prevented our having the kind of official Secrets Act that Britain has and that most countries have, as a matter of fact, which criminalize any and all release of classified information. We don't have a law like that, and it's because we had a revolution, a war of independence, a war of national liberation. We had, as a result of it, a First Amendment. Anyway, we were prosecuted despite that, and faced, as I said, eventually I faced 115 years in prison.
So it wasn't that you were acquitted, they dismissed the case. It was commonly accepted that Nixon, who put together that group called the Plumbers, to steal papers from your psychiatrist, eventually the same group were the ones who broke into the Watergate building. And then Nixon tried to cover that up, which led to his impeachment, which in turn led to his resignation. And I'll never forget where I was on that August day in 1974. I had been glued to the TV. He walked across the lawn, he got on that plane, and I really felt like, as an idealistic young teenager, that government was working, that this is the way it was supposed to go.
You were right. It was.
And
the way it was supposed to be working.
So I think that at the very least, your release of the Pentagon Papers led to his resignation. Would you have wanted more to happen?
I never had that in mind. I think going back to what I perceived in '69, Nixon had no intention of losing in Vietnam or of getting out of Vietnam. And by the way, for a reason that we didn't know at the time, which was that in the election of 1968, when he was facing Hubert Humphrey, he had colluded with General and President Nguyen Van Thieu of South Vietnam to take actions with him that encouraging Thieu not to do what he had earlier agreed to do, go to Paris to take part in negotiations for ending the war that Lyndon Johnson and the North Vietnamese had arrived at. And Thieu's decision not to do that, in which he was encouraged to do that, not to go to Paris, not to give the American people hope that the war was about to end, that was intended to help elect Richard Nixon. And actually, Thieu had that blackmail over him from then on. This was, by the way, no fake news. This was real collusion with a foreign government to affect an election.
Ronald Reagan did that with Jimmy Carter, being the hostages.
The October surprise issue, that in the '68, that there was going to be negotiations and maybe an end to the war, which was derailed by the Republican candidate against an incumbent. That was reproduced in 1980 with Ronald Reagan, when his representatives worked with Iran to assure there would be no release of American hostages held by Iran until Reagan was in. And in fact, the Iranians released the hostages not an hour before, but as they saw Reagan raise his right hand and be sworn in as president of the United States, which was, as in part, considerable part, as direct collusion with a foreign government to defeat an incumbent, Jimmy Carter. As I was just reading the other day that Carter was waiting almost to the last moment, hoping that those prisoners would be released while he was still president. I'm talking on Inauguration Day.
Yeah.
But no, they were careful not to do it until he'd been carefully sworn in, just to thumb in the eye to Carter. And so we've seen this before. In short, it's happened.